It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and just about any other shiny object that happens to attract my attention. Today, my special guest is Craig Detweiler, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, Selfies, Searching for the Image of God in a Digital Age. Craig, I just want to say thanks so much for joining us on today's show.
Well, thank you, Shaun. Honored to be a guest.
First off, I always like to begin these conversations with a bit of the author's backstory. So for you, I'd love to hear about, where did it say that interest in film or storytelling, when did that begin to emerge for you at a young age?
I think that I turned to movies as a way of trying to process the world and understand things that were going on. And I was actually attracted to old movies, to like black and white movies, Humphrey Bogart movies. I would come home from school and turn on the TV, and there was always maybe something obscure on some TV channel. And I ended up kind of falling in love with these private eyes and these detectives that would maybe take us to a slightly seedy side of town and show us maybe what was going on behind things. And so I think my understanding of original sin to some degree came through film noir, came through movies. And even I loved how Humphrey Bogart, maybe in Casablanca, would figure out how to be loyal to his friends and outsmart the authorities. And I think he kind of taught me a little bit about how to be a man, how to have a certain style, have a certain code of honor. And so then when I was introduced to Jesus at a later age and stage, I kind of filtered it through Humphrey Bogart. And so when I saw Jesus dealing with the Pharisees, where they're trying to entrap him with a certain line of questioning, and he figures out how to outsmart him, I'm like, okay, I see. Jesus and Bogart are really good at kind of navigating these treacherous waters, and so I think the what should we say, Jesus' subversive nature of outsmarting people at their own game, or dealing with those who might seek to entrap him. I think it was very attractive to me, and allowed me to enter into this notion of a personal relationship with Jesus that I heard about through Young Life. It just opened up an entire new world of possibilities for me as a young man. And so I've always felt like film and faith for me have always gone together. So I believe in the power of story. I believe in the power of media to communicate timeless truths about God and about us.
And how did that play out, say, in your educational journey, like early part of your career? What did it look like for you to pursue storytelling maybe in a more formal way?
Interestingly, while I was at seminary, at Fuller Seminary, basically, digging deeper into the ancient truths of Scripture and the enduring power of God's Word, I also was in a class where a television producer came to class and kind of offered us an invitation to go deeper and to come serve in Hollywood with him. And it was a class of, I don't know, maybe 60 people. And I was like the only one to raise my hand and say, yeah, I want to be part of that. And so he encouraged me. Coleman Luck is his name. He was producing a TV show called The Equalizer at the time on CBS. He encouraged me to apply to film school and to start writing and to pursue an education. So all I knew about writing and creative writing at that point was almost like doing skits and creative skits for Young Life. And so I literally put that in my application. I was like, well, I've been funny in front of 300 kids at a time, for a month of camp. It's a little bit like live theater, but maybe you won't see it that way. But surprisingly, USC did, and I was able to enroll at USC's University of Southern California Film School as a newly married person, and basically created a life in Southern California as a screenwriter, director, made documentaries, traveled around the world, and have always believed in the power of story to, burrow deeply into the things that ail us, into the things that may disturb us, to challenge us, and also provide maybe some relief and some joy as well.
Well, I think this will be a first. I've never had a guest who went from seminary to film school. So thanks for telling us about a whole new direction none of us who've done any level of seminary grad school before thought existed. So I love that. God can take us places we never expected.
Indeed.
Next, let's get into what you might call the story behind the book. There always seems to be some sort of an aha or a catalyst moment that will get your mind thinking in a direction. So I'd be curious what it was exactly that maybe alerted you to the need for a book like Selfies.
The book arose for me out of a particular selfie that created a bit of a international uproar. There was a young woman named Brianna who posted a photo of herself while she was touring a concentration camp in Germany. And she posted a photo of herself smiling, and she had headphones, Apple earbuds in her ear, and people were appalled that she would post a smiling selfie at Auschwitz, and it became a bit of a viral sensation with people kind of attacking her and how dare she, and doesn't she realize where she is, and doesn't she realize the space that she's within, and how can she be smiling? And so, in a sense, an innocent tweet, right? It started with something she posted on Twitter. Suddenly, there were articles and editorials written from around the world, and CNN asked me to comment upon this. What did I think? And I was actually believe it or not, I was in Europe at the time. I was in Germany. And so I was actually touring some of these very painful and harrowing places with my own children. And I guess I just realized that the next generation maybe hadn't been given the tools to understand sacred places and spaces. They'd been handed a phone, but there wasn't a user's manual that came with it. They don't necessarily know what digital decorum would look like. And yet they're being pounced upon by adults really around the world for being immature. Well, they are adolescents. They are acknowledging that they're immature. And so in a sense, I wrote a defense of Brianna that simply said, is it Brianna's fault that she posted this insensitive selfie? Or do we as adults have a responsibility to teach and to model a different kind of maybe digital discipleship than we have offered to young people? And that post itself probably got, 500,000 views. And so I realized there's just a lot of latent confusion and frustration around selfies. Everybody's taking them. Nobody knows exactly what's appropriate and when and why. An older generation is maybe dismissing an entire younger generation as narcissistic without maybe understanding why they post selfies. What were Brianna's reasons for posting this selfie? What did it mean to walk through Auschwitz for her? And why would she post a selfie about it? And why would she be smiling within the selfie? So all of those questions are the starting point for my book.
Well, and I think one of the most awkward selfie stories, and this selfie didn't actually happen, but an author friend of mine texted me one day. He's like, I just had one of the strangest author experiences I've ever had. I'm at the Y and I'm in the locker room and somebody walked in and was like, oh, hey, man, I love your books. Can we take a picture? And he's like, I declined. Public service announcement. Don't ask authors to let you take selfies with them in the locker room. That's just kind of creepy and weird. It is an interesting thing because obviously when we see images, pictures that people are sharing on the web, we come at those with our own lens. We make a bunch of assumptions about why people are posting those pictures, what exactly it is that they're trying to share. Yet, if we take a step back and look at, say, whether it's the Gen Xers or the millennials or Gen Z, and yet the unnamed generations that will follow, selfies, sharing on social media, this is a huge part of how they relate to the world. It's a huge part of how they express themselves. I don't think we can always put the same constraints maybe that we put on ourselves or on older generations, because we look at how we want to relate to the world is different than how they're natively just reaching out and sharing. So would love to have you just give a little bit more commentary about how can we develop eyes and ears to really see and hear on social media? Because I think we have to really take a step back and try to understand what exactly they're trying to express. And I think Brianna's story that you shared was a perfect example of that.
Well, yes, I think that's a great question, Shaun. I guess what I want us to do is to try to step inside the shoes of that teenager and understand what it is they're reaching for, in a sense, when they are both self-imaging and then putting themselves out there for commentary at the same time. What kind of moment are they trying to capture? In my research for the book, I actually, a group of researchers from BYU actually said that there tends to be three different reasons why people post selfies and take self-images. And there are the self-promoters, kind of that Kardashian effect where they're kind of just talking about themselves all the time and kind of a blatant self-promotion manner. And they're not actually interested in feedback. They just want to put their face out there and kind of spread their fame, spread their brand. And that's maybe an abuse of the medium a little bit. But the other two, I think, are very interesting. The next group are using it really as a form of communication. It's a way of keeping up with friends. It's a way of informing family. This is what I'm doing. This is where I am. This is how I'm feeling. And with Brianna, it came out that she and her father had talked a lot about Auschwitz, concentration camps, the painful history of the Holocaust and World War II, as it was a point of connection for them. And he had recently died. He was deceased. And so for her to finish kind of that relationship or extend that relationship, that love for her dad in going to Auschwitz, it was kind of maybe a sweet moment of her remembering him and remembering their discussions. And so she was smiling even in a place riddled with pain and horror. Even in a season of grief, she was finding a point of connection. And so communication, I think, is the second piece that people are interested in selfies. The third, which I think is the most intriguing to me, is autobiographical. People take selfies to mark images and moments in their life, and they're trying to understand who they are and whose they are in those moments. And so when we take a picture of a selfie amidst a mountaintop, we may be having a literal mountaintop moment that we want to remember. It could be a sweet moment with God that we want to commemorate. And so I guess I want to give people plenty of room to express, the joys of life, those lovely moments. I think where it becomes pressure-packed is when teenagers, adolescents, and even adults feel pressure to perform via the selfie, and that they're having to maybe project a false version of themselves. And so when you see Brianna smiling at Auschwitz, you're like, that doesn't seem appropriate. And yet selfies have kind of demanded that we project a certain level of happiness or satisfaction. So can we get behind the smile, and can we develop an empathy that says, I'm going to try to look through your selfie and what you're trying to project and see maybe the pain and the longing and the need that resides behind it.
I think one of the inherent dangers with social media is we can get ourselves in a place where our self-image, our self-worth really comes from the way people respond to what we're sharing and posting online, kind of the feedback that we're getting, What can people do to start building up their self-image or their worth according to what God says about them? Because I think it's kind of an interesting downside of social media is that we're all very much concerned about what other people think about us these days.
Absolutely, Shaun. I think that's maybe one of the great cautions from the book is that when you're entering into this game of trying to identify and develop your own identity through social media, through other people liking your self-image, you're entering a dangerous game that could kind of come back to sabotage you. So what I try to do in the book is really go back to Genesis and try to go back to our origins as created by God, beloved by God, created in the image of God. So I lean into that imago Dei that is at the root of our personhood and try to anchor us in that we don't have to perform on social media for approval, but that God loves us and created us, gave us that face, gave us that image that is precious in His sight. And if we can do that for ourselves, then can we also do that for others? Can we extend that kind of grace? Can we see each other with a certain level of dignity? Can we extend that kind of respect to each other? That's certainly the hope. The additional move that I make within the Selfies book is to realize that when it says that we were created in the image of God, that suggests to me that, in a sense, we are God's selfies. That God is a self-imaging God who felt the need to express and extend Himself into the world in a particular kind of way. And so when we're taking selfies, are we actually kind of tapping into that divine imprint that's been given to us? So I believe we are God's selfies. And as such, we need to love and honor each other in a much more intentional way within the digital space.
I think one of the tendencies is because we have such a high volume of selfies just going up constantly in social media that we kind of write them off as kind of a fad. But really, these are a huge cultural phenomenon. I don't think they're going away anytime soon. Would love to have you give us some commentary on how selfies actually fit into the history of self-portraits and self-expression. How have we seen selfies throughout history?
It's a great question, Shaun. I decided rather than sort of looking at selfies as a new phenomenon, could I go back throughout art history and maybe trace a line of self-portraiture, and to realize that at least in the early days of art making, really only the rich could afford to commission an image of themselves. And so you'll see images of ancient kings, whether that's, or queens, right? So whether that's images of, Cleopatra in Egypt or, Roman rulers, all the way back to that ancient era. But even as you go up through maybe the early days, 14th century, you'd see French kings or English monarchs. Only did once artists started painting portraits of themselves, did we suddenly have this notion of like, oh, a self-portrait is actually a very intense personal expression that, so we would honor someone like Rembrandt and say how brilliant that they took this time to paint themselves, to study themselves, to reflect upon themselves. And if you even move further towards America with, say the Puritans, the idea of taking stock of your life, of journaling your life became very important to your spiritual life as part of your daily discipline to kind of measure yourselves. How am I doing? How am I feeling? And that wasn't viewed as selfish. That was viewed as just part of an ongoing relationship with God. And so I want to connect selfies in that way and say that maybe for a previous generation that would obviously pray before a meal and be grateful for food, this next generation might, in taking a picture of that food and themselves in that restaurant at that time, that's an interesting form of prayer, perhaps, where they are pausing with this device, this camera, and trying to say, here I am in this moment. And I am full of gratitude. I'm surrounded by beauty. I love the moment that I'm in, and I want to share the beauty of that moment. So I think the thing that has shifted is that in the old days, only a few could afford paint. Only a few were trained to make self-images. And now, thanks to the cell phones, it's ubiquitous. In fact, it's mobiquitous, right? We have mobile ubiquity. We're all able to take and broadcast our pictures at any time. And so we're just waking up to a new era of self-imaging where the possibilities have never been so prevalent for people at all ages and stages of life.
Well, and because mobile phones, smartphones, they are ubiquitous at this time, one of the things that we've really seen emerge, and I think in a major way within just the past 2 or 3 years, is where people are using self-photography, selfies, if you will, in protest and to try to push for justice. Talk to us a bit about how people are using selfies in that context.
We've all, I guess, been deputized as citizens who can be journalists, who can be reporters, who can tell us both where they are and what they're seeing. That can be a very powerful tool. You had protests in Hong Kong amongst young people. It was called, I believe they called it the Umbrella protest or the Umbrella movement. And they're kind of resisting this Chinese government, mainland China, that was impinging upon the democracy that they were used to in Hong Kong. So it was a lot of Christian young people in Hong Kong taking their faith to the streets and taking their cell phones with them to say, hey, this is what's being done in an unjust way. Obviously, we see now a lot of reporting on police abuse, and there's a lot of controversy around that. And people are like, how could this be happening? And I don't understand, and it seems worse than ever. I'm not sure it's worse than ever, but people didn't have the ability, in a sense, to defend themselves with a camera, to document a moment that could be very painful and very unjust. So the democratization of media has allowed all of us to become journalists, all of us to be reporters, and it's unsettling, kind of the powers that be in some of those structures that are used to kind of controlling the images and controlling the narrative. It's actually threatening newspapers to some degree because the other stories are able to emerge. But I see that as a positive thing, that there's more power in the hands of people. The question is, what will we do with these tools that have been placed in our hands? Will we be responsible stewards of these gifts that we're handing to our kids as young people that we all now carry with us really at all times, almost 24/7?
Yeah, it definitely is an interesting shift just with how technology has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and portable. In many ways, the average kid across the street could potentially have more impact on something that's going on in society, in the news and culture, more impact, say, than even a major news outlet or more of a formal organization with, traditional gatekeepers. I always tell people, I feel like when it comes to all types of media and expression, we're in the Wild West right now, whether we're talking about publishing or podcasting or YouTube or even selfies. It's a different world, and I feel like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg of what's emerging. There's a lot more change ahead that we haven't even realized yet. Absolutely. And I think for a church that maybe has been used to top-down control, to be able to say, I will control the message, it's destabilizing to realize that anybody in your congregation can have access to a broad audience. But I think it behooves us then to be much more active in our discipleship of others and to kind of lean into that power for creativity and generativity that is contained in our phones. And so the book, the Selfies book, is trying to give people even more permission to be more creative with how they use the tool that has been placed in their hands, and to maybe think of themselves more seriously as artists,
who are trying to reflect God's beauty, God's sense of justice, maybe a daily practice of worship. Can we do that through our phones? I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so.
Christians, we're all out on all the social media websites like anybody else, but any rules of the roads or best practices you would have for believers so they're making good use of their time on Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook and Twitter and wherever else they happen to find themselves online?
In my previous book, iGods, I talked about Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple, which were sort of the big four companies that were controlling things. But I think for young people, Instagram and Snapchat have really captured people's imagination. And one thing I talk about in the book is how much insta pressure is attached to Instagram, because those images tend to be perfect. They tend to be idealized. And so when you're looking at Instagram, I think it's helpful to realize these are people's best moments of their life, curated and filtered in a very particular kind of way. And so it's easy to get depressed, I think, when we're looking at other people's idealized lives. We're looking at their vacation pictures while we're sitting at home and saying, look at their beautiful life and what about mine? And so that tendency to compare and to engage in the form of envy, I think is a strong temptation that we have to fight against and resist. And I think we also need to think about, maybe think before we post, in terms of, will this actually bless people? Or is this, who or what is being elevated through my post? Am I calling attention to myself? Am I trying to elevate my own social status? I think we're just now starting to think about how to be sensitive towards others. As a small example, in our family, we realized that it wasn't good if our kids, we have teenagers, we didn't want other guests to post pictures at a birthday party for our kids. Because as they're taking pictures at the party, they're also communicating maybe to teenagers who weren't invited. Maybe, my kids would have invited more people if they could, but we can't invite everybody. Well, they didn't want to send a message that you weren't invited or you're less important. They wanted to honor the people who were there. Well, one way to honor people who are there is by not broadcasting to those who aren't there. And so we sort of ask for a no social media kind of policy within that party space as a way of trying to care and love others who may not be included and are suffering maybe from a fear of missing out. FOMO, right, is a big thing with teenagers, that fear of missing out. And so we don't want to promote that via social media as well.
One of the unique features in the book is at the end of each chapter, you have what you call selfie assignments. Would be curious to hear, what's your intention and hope with a little bit of homework they're getting at the end of each chapter?
As a professor, as an educator, I think it's always good to have some assignments at the end of a chapter. What do you do with this information? I don't want it to just be information. I want it to be something that can apply to your life. But as an example, there's a chapter where I talk about, there's a lot of pressure to be happy or to be perfect on social media. I want to give people space to maybe take some selfies that are a little more reflective. That might be moments not when we're on top, but when we're feeling blue. And can we make room for maybe a shadow side of our life? I think Snapchat has been very, very popular with teenagers because it's a place where your digital trail may not follow you. Disappearing photos maybe allow you to be more honest, more forthright with what you're feeling. It's a chance to let your hair down. And I worry about the next generation not having safe places online to just be themselves, to be messy and imperfect and to be struggling and confused. It's very hard to put that side of yourself out in social media where everything else is a little bit airbrushed and filtered. So where's the unfiltered side of media? So yeah, there's assignments where I ask you to maybe take black and white selfies, to take a selfie when that expresses your feelings right now, that could express feelings of frustration or inadequacy, that to take a selfie that might be a form of praise to God. How do you look through the camera, and can you see yourself as beautiful in God's sight? Can you see God, in a sense, through that lens, looking at you with love, with acceptance, with approval? Can you both look at yourself and look at God looking at you in a different kind of way through the selfie making process?
Craig, when you think of readers, say, getting to the last page of the book, if they only take away one core idea, maybe this is something that propels them forward, they're living differently, they're doing things differently now. What do you most hope that is?
I hope that we would believe that the camera and the cell phone are tools that we can control responsibly, and that we can feel that God loves when we are expressing ourselves, that God loves who we are, and that God sees us as precious and beautiful in His sight. And so when we're making selfies, we're not necessarily performing for others, but we are people already pre-approved by God as fearfully and wonderfully made.
Craig, where can people go online to connect with you and find out more about the book?
Great question, Shaun. So I've recently become president of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology in Seattle, Washington. So we are a graduate school. We're educating people for Master of Divinity, Masters in Counseling, maybe Theology and Culture, those types of degrees. But if you want to find out more about the book, I'd go to selfiesandgod.com. And there's an excerpt from the book. You can read some of the first chapter, get a sense of the flow of things. Selfiesandgod.com. And of course, check me out on social media if you want. I can't write a book like this and not be on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all those other places.
We'll make it easy for the listeners like we do with every episode. We'll be sure to have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can pick up your own copy of the book, places where you can connect with Craig online as well. So just head on over to ShaunTabatt.com after you're done listening. We'll have that all linked up for you right there. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Craig Detweiler. Once again, our book today was Selfies, Searching for the Image of God in a Digital Age. Again, if you want to connect with Craig and find out more about the book, a good place to start is going to be the book's website at selfiesandgod.com. And Craig, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Shaun, thanks for doing a great job, and honored to have been a guest.